So, thank you very much for coming. A big welcome. Today is a discussion. It is not a launch. It's not a long presentation. It's a discussion with our partners and experts around the topic, the catalyst for the day, which is the big idea. And I'm really pleased to have alongside me the real experts who are part of the panel, who are going to be doing some short presentations to get the conversation going. But I hope and insist that all of you get ready with your most difficult questions. We're streaming this live on YouTube, and we've got it on Twitter, so maybe we'll get some even trickier questions. But as it's one of my colleagues who is filtering that, I'll ask her to keep the hardest ones away from me. And so without further ado, let me just do a little introduction. So on my right, we've got Emmanuel. Emmanuel is the director of Yes Ghana, which is a leading youth organisation in Ghana. And excitingly for us at Restless Development, has agreed to be a partner in piloting the big idea, which you'll hear a lot more about from him, and hopefully from other members in the audience. So really excited to have Emmanuel with us. Next to him is Ben Taylor, who is an open development consultant for Twaweza, which all of you Swahili speakers will know immediately means something like we can. Twaweza is a citizen-led monitoring initiative for change in East Africa. They are one of the leading southern-based East African organisations and are very well known and well respected for their monitoring and media work with open government at its heart and open development at its heart across Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania. On my left I have Erich Sahar from Oxfam, who's a private sector advisor. In fact, they've got all their titles in front of them, so if I'm getting them wrong, just nod at me and ignore what I'm saying. And is leading the campaign on Behind the Brand, which is about scoring policies of the large food and beverage companies. He will tell you a lot more about that, but as you can imagine, very relevant, so thank you so much for coming in. And on his left, Neva, who's kindly come in slightly last minute and will be responding to the other panellists. She heads CAFOD's work on the MDGs, which is highly relevant today, and also sits on Beyond 2015 Global Executive Committee, both of whom, in both of those hats, we've worked together on many occasions at different points in the post-2015 process, so a real pleasure to have you along with us. So those are our panellists. As we get to the questions, I would really appreciate it if you could introduce yourselves and your title, or at least something relevant to the day. If you feel you have no title relevant to the day, just make something up. But we would love to know who's in the room. The most important thing to say is that when the discussion is over, we didn't offer you tea and water at the beginning because we want to offer you much more exciting drinks at the end. And so when the discussion formally is finished and we stop streaming it live, just straight back down that corridor we'll be offering drinks. It'll be just after 5 p.m, so you can all feel that's morally acceptable with your bosses back in your offices. So thank you very much for coming. Without further ado, I'm going to start off with a short presentation from myself and from Restless Development's perspective on the big idea. It's not detailed, but it is an important part of the story. It is just a little synopsis on where the big idea came from. But just to start with, as a brief introduction to Restless Development, Restless Development places young people at the forefront of change and development. It's what it's done for over 25 years. And for something like 20 of those, it did it hugely successfully, simply by that model of saying, we're going to hand over all of our development programs to people under the age of 25. They will design them, they will put them together, they will monitor them, they will evaluate them, and they will carry them out in communities and towns and rural areas around Africa and South Asia. And that was that, and we had a huge impact as an organisation. We were very proud, as many of the organisations are, of their work in this room. But then in the last 5 years, we asked the question, how does that impact turn itself into influence? What can young people do to translate the amazing work that we all, I think, know young people can do, and actually translate that into their influence on where development is going, their influence on the big debates around poverty, around exclusion, around social degradation, and all the various different areas that we're all engaged in? What is it that is needed to turn programs and leadership by young people into powerful processes that can engage policymakers? We concluded that it is a mixture of young people taking up research, young people actually taking up the battle to bring knowledge from the field to the table, to bring their stories qualitatively to the table as well as their data. We concluded also that young people need to be at the table and not just at the beginning of the conversation, the song and dance, the token urban elite 33-year-old who happens to run 4 businesses that so often end up in a conversation in an international process. But those very young people living in Karamoja in northern Uganda, how do we get them at the table of national processes, local processes, and even international processes? And the last part that we concluded was, from our own unique perspective, is that we had young people who were graduating from our programs who were turning into a powerful force themselves. That we have something like 20,000 alumni, and most of those are from the countries where we're working. And how can they also become influencers of this debate, because they're not only from those countries, but they've worked in leadership in the communities that they're in. And so that's Restless Development as a background. I'm very happy to answer more questions on that, but I would suggest at the point of drinks, because it's not the point of why we're here today. We're here today because an idea was seeded that came out of all of that. And it started here in the Mo Ibrahim Forum. The foundation have their forum once a year, which is focused on governance and the economics of governance. And they do it through data. And they bring some of the most senior people from around Africa, the head of the Africa Development Bank, and all the various economists and presidents turn up for this forum on a near annual basis. And in 2012, the foundation decided to focus it on young people. And we were asked to bring 25 young people from all corners of Africa. Again, not just urban elite, but from east, north, south, from rural, from poor suburban communities. And they came and we trained them and we worked with them. And they're there in the audience, sitting there. And I just had to sit for a day and watch this unfold. And the obvious thing for Restless Development happened. Young people, one after the other, stood up and made powerful interjections to the conversation that was going on the stage. One by one, they stood up, and as you can imagine, because so many of you are converted to this cause of young people, they were brilliant. They were powerful, they were charismatic, and they brought new ideas. But there's one part that stood out to me that seeded the idea, and it's this. The bit that was in each of their hands at this conference that was going on. In every case, they were holding this in their hands. I've got a copy of it here. They were holding the data that had been produced by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, full of the most comprehensive set of data that I have ever read on youth in Africa. Projections for the next 50 years, economics set alongside social conditions, and these young people had it in their hands. And because of that, they had to be listened to. They didn't just stand up and do the charismatic, enthusiastic, oh yes, aren't young people great thing. They were powerful. And when this young lady stood up, and that panel were talking about economics, and spending 3 hours talking about growth, and that the simple answer at the heart of everything is growth in Africa, she stood up and gave a small and short, pithy piece straight out of this book on why they were wrong. Why it was not actually correct, that if you look at graph number X and compare it with graph number Y, what you can see is youth employment rising in 10 of the top growth countries in the continent. And so she went on. And the audience was silenced. And again, that little ring that you can see there, it's the data that's sitting in her hand as she was speaking that she was able to do this. For many of you as experts in data, this is pretty obvious stuff, perhaps. But it inspired me and it made me think, because I got to sit there for the day doing nothing. I sat looking into space, listening to these brilliant young people, and I thought about our programs that were going on at the time. 4 things were happening in parallel, literally in November 2012. One of them was in Zambia. We were running a campaign through young people. Young people put this book together, it's a cartoon set, taking on a policy that had been in place for 20 years in Zambia. And I think in the debate later, this is really important. The policy already existed that young people, young girls who get pregnant in Zambia must be allowed to re-enter schools. And yet, 90% don't. I've just been over in Zambia 2 weeks ago, and it's still the case that one lady stood up and said, we had 19 pregnancies in my school last year, 18 of them have never been seen again. And we were running a simple Know Your Policy campaign using media and cartoons. And it made me thoughtful. The second thing that was going on at the time was the election in Sierra Leone. And the focus was violence. In every bilateral meeting, I visited Sierra Leone, we were sitting down about how to shut down the hatches. What are we going to do when the young people are going to get on the street? So we came up with an idea, and we went to our ex-volunteers, our alumni, and said, how do you want to do this? How do you want to turn that conversation around? And they said, we'd like to go out and do some research and put a manifesto together that has nothing to do with what we want the government who gets in to do, but is about how we want these elections to go, what we think a successful election will be. And they went district to district, to every district, and they put a manifesto together about what young people are demanding happens, and they presented it to all the parties, and they did campaigns on it, and they got it on the street. I make no claims about what happened. It was a very peaceful election with a transition of government, but it was a very exciting moment for us to even be engaging in. The third was at the same time in Uganda, we had a very different process going on, and it wasn't from our idea, it was in partnership with IDS in Sussex here, was to get young people in Karamoja, northern Uganda, one of the poorest regions on the planet, half of whom were illiterate, to run a qualitative study on what is really going on for young people in those communities. They didn't even get a heading. They weren't told livelihoods or sexual health. It was just, what is life like, and how is the world treating you, and how are you engaged in it? And they were just as we were in the conference in Senegal, at the Moebium conference. This book was coming out, and it is, I have to say, a damning account of aid. In many ways, it's a damning account of our own work and everybody else's work there. There is one moment when they say, NGOs come, NGOs go, it's as if they were never there. If only they would employ us and ask us what is going on. They describe the sacredness of cows and that nobody has ever asked them about it. And if they only understood that, they would see that the maize projects that are being set up and have been for the last 30 years have not been relevant to their lives, and so on. It was an impressive part. They've now set up community-based organisations and are doing further research. The final one was down in Tanzania. We were putting data sets together. So young people there were at the other end saying, we want to put our own data together about the status of young people in Tanzania. And this is the Swahili version. So Swahili speakers amongst you will be able to understand some of the words on this. There is an English version that I have here. And this data set was the second year that they'd used it. The first year, nothing much came from it. The second year, it is now being used as one of the Bibles in the kind of bilateral and aid agency and NGO world. One of my colleagues was down there 3 weeks ago and said in 3 different meetings she saw this being utilised as the kind of background data. And every number in here was generated by young people doing surveys across, you can see over on the left, if you can just see it, across the country where they've been doing surveys on the status of young people. So that was it. That was the inspiration for the idea. But then it became a big idea. And the reason it became a big idea was a very lucky moment for Restless, was that we got a call from our partners, DFID, who I'm really pleased to see represented here today, and they quite literally picked up the phone about 6 weeks in advance of the first high-level panel meeting of the post-2015 agenda, which I'm going to assume all of you are aware of, and said, can you bring young people to meet for 2 hours with the panel in a closed session with them? Now, many of you as partners know what happened next. We did, as Restless, very little. We reached out to all of our partners. We brought 25 brilliant young people from around the world. They decided they wanted to run a wonderful stunt. I had been asked to chair the meeting with all these high-level panelists, which I was very nervous about. They gave me 5 typical statements that are made about young people. As I started making them at the front of the room, one by one, young people in this room with the high-level panelists stood up and said, "I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Chairman, but I completely and totally disagree with what you're saying." The wonderful part was that the high-level panelists had been listening to me and nodding and going, "Absolutely, that's dead right about young people." And they took over. And the 5th person said, "I think what we need to do today is ask you to sit down and we're going to chair the rest of this meeting." And for the next 2 hours, young people chaired a meeting with the high-level panelists. They were asked to come back to the next 2 sessions, and by Bali there were 100 young people who were invited to join the process. But it wasn't that was the essence of the big idea. What we decided to do was put together a toolkit on the back of that to get young people to know how they could go off and do consultations in their own countries. So this toolkit, which I'm really happy to share with you, was put together. It's a lovely interactive toolkit on how do you get from illiterate young people in rural areas to very literate urban elites in a room to talk about post-2015 at a qualitative level. This has now been used in 50 countries by UNICEF, and we did it in 12 countries. And here is where I'm going to conclude for you guys and pass on to the panelists. We did it in 12 countries. It was a qualitative piece of research, looking deeper than the surveys that were going on, which we've partnered with One and with The World We Want, that said jobs and health and so on. We looked deeper and said, what really matters to you? And then what came out instead, if you can read the top left word, is governance. That was not the word they used, but it is the summary of how we would describe what was being described back to us in those 12 different countries from across the world. The way they said it is young people want to see effective governments held to account and structures where young people have access to decision making. That came higher than health and jobs. And it was that turned a good idea from can we get young people in rural communities that we know are already getting around tables doing that amazing know your policy stuff in Zambia like this. And in your high-level panel meetings, because we started doing them at a national level as well, talking about big subjects like corruption, like this young man is talking about. 2 weeks ago, this young person talking at GPEDC in Mexico. But the question was, can we link that to the debate on the ground that Restless and all of you as partners are already brilliant at? Can we link the big debate, the high-level panel debates that were going on that will lead to post-2015 goals? Can we link those two? Can young people really influence it? And sitting in that Mo Ibrahim forum, my conclusion was the answer is knowledge and data. And I felt, yes, we can do it, because through the high-level panel and through the Mo Ibrahim forum, I am very proud of the fact that my colleagues didn't make them Restless events. We made them partner events. Of the 25 people in the high-level panel, 1 was from Restless Development, the rest were from Plan and local organisations and so on. We had 59 organisations who we talked to through those 2 processes, who all bought into, yes, wouldn't it be fabulous if we could bring young people to data to young people and create a powerful movement. And those 59 organisations have a presence in every country on the planet. And if they have a unified desire and can reach hundreds of thousands of young people day in, day out, perhaps it would be possible to do this. Perhaps it would be possible to have young people at the heart of what everybody is describing as the data revolution and demonstrate that they have a power and a freedom and an ability to make change happen in a way as a body that others might not be able to do. And so to conclude, we have a pilot programme that we have just begun to set up. Justine Greening, the Secretary of State for International, was at the presentation of the big idea in Bali at the final high-level panel meeting. She expressed her support, and so in my typical way, I chased her and her colleagues all the way to London and said, thank you for the support. Do you fancy supporting the big idea and what we're trying to set up? And fabulously, they said yes. We're going to seed fund this, and we'd like to see whether in a pilot, this really is possible. At a technical level, is it true? As an inspiration, it sounds great, but could this really happen? And in many ways, today is a launch of that. But it's a launch of that because this is a discussion on how we're going to do it. And so we are piloting for the next 18 months in 3 countries just to ask those questions. Can we demonstrate whether data in the hands of young people can make out a standout contribution to accountability? Can they build collaboration with experts from a range of sectors and provide learning for us all on how this might happen? And ultimately, can governments and decision makers change policy and practice in response to youth demands based on information and analysis they generate? I have gone over, but I am the chair, so I'm allowed to go over because nobody's here to stop me. But I will stop there and now be ruthless with the other panelists and cut them short when they say anything controversial against that. I jest. I obviously believe it is possible. I know through those pieces of evidence of what Restless has already been able to do, what its partners have been able to do. We have partners in the room that we already work with, partners that are sitting here at the table. We have War Child represented, who do fabulous stuff in a similar way with children in the most difficult regions on the planet in conflict, and many others besides. So I believe it is possible, but I know this is not a silver bullet. And I know this is a very, very technical and tricky area. And therefore I'm going to stop, and I'm going to ask panelists to give their lens and their perspective on governance, on data, on young people, on the possibilities that we've brought to the table. And then I'm going to open it to the floor to all of you. Thank you. Good. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Manuel, who, as I said, is one of our new partners, who's taking a punt and jumping in and saying, we think that sounds like a cracking idea too. And he's going to give us a little background on Yes and his experiences with the big idea. Let me see if I can jump straight over to your presentation. I think.
So thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity, and thanks, Nick, for your introductory words. I think we could actually just close after hearing you. That was really, for me, the best presentation of the big idea so far. Thank you. So thanks also, Nick, also because, like you said, we are the newest partner just jumping in. But we're jumping in with full conviction, at least for the Ghana case, that we believe that the big idea is the next big thing for the advocacy work that we do already in Ghana. And as you said, we've just started a collaboration, and we hope that within the next 18 months, we can demonstrate a strong collaboration that can then be scaled. Well, Yes Ghana, we just say Yes Ghana, but Yes means Youth Empowerment Synergy. I invite you to have a look at yesghana.org. We do a lot of work in youth development policy practice and to some extent research. Like Nick said, just like Restless Development, we aim to place young people's issues and organizations at the heart of development processes in Ghana. We've done that in various ways, as you might be able to see on the website. Well, throughout my work at Yes Ghana for at least 12 years, I've witnessed at many forums where young people have been asked to provide the evidence or to support their demands with the evidence. To 2002 in Johannesburg, when, as you may be aware, that we had the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which came up with Agenda 21 components, and one one important successes for the youth movement is that there was a section that focused on young people. But then the ball was thrown back to the court of young people, saying, you need to tell us how to get the youth policy options in there realized, not only at the global level, but first of all at the national level. And that became a big challenge, because subsequently in 2004, at the Commission on Sustainable Development, and so for those of us who follow the real process, we had several, I think the CSD ended last year, but for close to 16 or so annual sessions, there have been continuous progress in following up the commitments in Agenda 21. And in one of those sessions in 2004, we put a question to Jeffrey Sachs, who was, I think, is still the Secretary General's advisor on the Millennium Development Goals. And we said, what exactly is the best way young people can be engaged in this, work towards achieving the MDGs by 2015? And he gave a very deep sigh and just simply said, you tell us. And whoa, so again, a repetition of what happened in Johannesburg. So at that point, we took up the challenge, and many of you may have seen that report that came out. We call it the Youth and MDGs report. You can Google it. But just trying to demonstrate again at that global level how policymakers, not today, but also previously, have consistently thrown the ball back to young people to try to support their demands with the evidence and with suggestions of what works best. But I think that in the context of the big idea, the best example of how I've witnessed young people being asked to provide some supporting evidence to their demands is in 2012, when we had a huge national conference. We call it the Voices of Youth Conference, and this preceded Ghana's general elections in 2012. And if you're familiar with elections in Africa, it's the biggest thing. And so the politicians will jump head over heels to try and get a speaking slot, and they all turn up. But what ran through most of their presentations was that you need to tell us how to move from demanding change to actually achieving that change. So everybody agrees. In fact, the politicians agree that they themselves believe change is important, and we need change in this and that sector. But you need to begin to tell us how to achieve this change that you're asking for. So clearly, if you put these three examples together, from Joburg to New York and back to Accra, it's clear that young people and those of us who work in youth development need to begin to work towards concrete evidence that supports the youth change process and the youth demands that we place on the table. I think there's growing recognition. I don't know any country yet that don't, or at least at the highest political level, that has not yet voiced out the knowledge and the acceptance of the need to include young people in development processes. I think most institutions, most governments, most international organizations, even most local governments agree that youth participation is crucial to achieving meaningful development. What we may not have achieved, however, is how to do it and the evidence base for it. So this is where the big idea comes in. And I think that the presentation by Nick starts from this point for me, because the connection is so strong. But I've been asked to just talk about the Ghana case and what we bring to the collaboration on the big idea. Ghana, as you all know, it's not one of those countries still lingering in the nightmares of dictatorship or any of those sorts, compared to many developing countries. these days we like to say compared also to developed countries, we have a fairly stable democracy. We joke sometimes that we count our ballot papers with lamps in the darkness, but we always come up with our results before the US does. If you remember what happened in the year 2000. There are strong institutions. We're still growing, but civil society in particular as an institution outside of the state, it's strong. I mean, I can point to 1001, just to exaggerate, policies that government is currently implementing or is in the process of passing in Parliament. For example, the Right to Information Bill is currently where it is because civil society almost drafted it. Civil society is at the forefront of the anti-corruption struggle. Civil society, and especially young people, are driving all of the movement for peace and stability and so on. So Ghana is definitely doing well when we just talk about the broader concept of social accountability and getting things done in a more inclusive way. 3 minutes. Okay. What we haven't done so well is bringing young people to the forefront of that social accountability struggle. And more importantly, building the evidence base, as I said a few minutes ago. So over the next 18 months, we will be collaborating with the Big Idea brought-up process to go through this process as we've laid out here. Let me just quickly add, before you start imbibing it, that it's not a done deal yet. It's still under rigorous development. We are refining and retuning and looking straight in the face of Stacy and my other colleagues who are still working to get it even more in a better shape. But the components are largely there. We will start, and actually we've started, to build a strong coalition around open data in Ghana, led by young people, but with broad consultation and engagement with various stakeholders. We've had some delegation from Big Idea already in Ghana who have met with various stakeholders, and we've had a roundtable and a joint consultation in that respect. Moving on, we're going to have young people, as in the case of Nick's examples from Tanzania, go out there and generate data that we can use in the next phase to prepare messages that seek to change policy for the common good. Those messages will form the basis for us to engage with nationwide advocacy processes and hopefully ultimately engage with more stakeholders at national but also local forums. And ultimately, we hope that we can achieve some policy changes. For the next 18 months, we may not be able to measure impact, and especially the policy changes that we seek. But our focus for the next 18 months is more about learning. We want to answer those questions that Nick ended his presentation with. That can young people actually do this? And if so, what works in the case of Ghana? And because this project is piloted in 3 countries, we will try to bring the evidences together from the 3 pilot countries and build a strong learning from these 3 places, and ultimately be able to scale, hopefully, when we move on to the post-2015 and we have a framework. So that's where I end by just saying that you're welcome to the new era of youth participation and active citizenship for an open and transparent development, not only for Ghana, but I believe also in the interest of the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Really inspiring stuff. So I'm going to change slides again, and as I do, I'm going to hand over to Ben Taylor, who can introduce himself, and then I'll put the slides up.
Thank you, Nick. Can you hear me okay? As Nick said earlier, my name is Ben Taylor. I work for an organisation called Troeza in East Africa. Though I'm not based in East Africa, I'm based here in the UK. Troeza, as Nick also said, means roughly we can do it, or sometimes translated as yes we can. We like to think we got there before Barack Obama. As you'll see from my title there, data is cool, but there ain't no data-driven revolution. I'm actually going to be asking some challenging questions for the big idea about some of the difficulties in using data for accountability, based partly on our experiences as Troeza, but also on a variety of other experiences of people around the world. This is always my starting point. And when we think about the idea of a data revolution, I think it's always very important to think about who are the people this data revolution is for. I attended a meeting, I believe a few other people in this room were there, in New York a few months ago, in which a data revolution was essentially described as, let's give national statistics bodies more money. That was the limit of the ambition of what a data revolution means. And for me, this is what the data revolution has to be about in some way, about meeting the needs of people like this. This happens to be a family that I know particularly well, but I could have chosen any family from many parts of the world. The potential of open data, the data revolution idea, I think is very clear. We can all recite the potential, where it comes from and so on. Information is power is a truism, and it's a cliche, but it's become a cliche because it has some real truth to it. Technology makes data more powerful now than ever before in terms of collecting, sharing, publishing, and so on. And actually, the high-level panel report included a call for a second revolution, which hasn't got nearly as much attention as the first revolution, the data revolution, did. They actually also called for a transparency revolution. And putting the two together, a data revolution and transparency revolution, for me, kind of doubles the power of what can be done. However, all too often, both we hold our hands up as Troeza and say we haven't always got this right ourselves. And I believe it's pretty common all around the world that initiatives that are trying to work with data to improve accountability or to change policies and so on, there are an awful lot of challenges that are faced. And this is just an example of one such challenge. There are many more that could be highlighted. I won't go through and explain the detail. I'm sure you can all interpret that for yourselves. But I will say a little bit more about this one here. This was a program called Measure Matone that I worked on and led in Tanzania for a few years, where we took a really interesting data set. I know Laura here actually knows the data pretty well as well. It's data on rural water supply in Tanzania. Really interesting, really powerful data potentially. And we tried to find ways of using that data and using it to encourage people living in rural parts of Tanzania to get involved and to put pressure on local government to improve water supply services in their area. We produced an awful lot of publications of this type. We produced, I think, a total of over 200,000 publications just in 3 districts. And we got, over 6 months, we got 54 people taking action as a result. In other words, almost nothing. Well below our target, which was up in the several thousands. So the challenge that we faced was very stark, that was there in front of us, and people were simply not engaging despite being given information packaged in ways that we felt was interesting and accessible. People weren't engaging with that, or didn't feel that it was relevant to them, or didn't feel that they could do anything with that information. And I'll come to some of those reasons in a moment. Let's kind of following on from the same issue really, is that one of the problems we found is that the data that we were using, that we were presenting, was not working for these people. It was not engaging them in ways that were relevant to them, that were interesting to them. Despite the huge efforts that we went to make it as accessible and as user-friendly as possible, it wasn't getting that kind of response. Revolutions are driven by people, not data. I think if you take anything from my presentation today, I think that's the key point. Whether you're talking about a data revolution, a transparency revolution, or empowerment of the poor, or whatever change it is we're looking for, it's going to be driven by people, not by data. Actually, this is one reason why I'm such a big fan of the Big Idea. Is that I think Restless Development is an organisation that really understands people, particularly young people, and it is in a great position to succeed where others have gone before and failed in using data for accountability and other purposes. And I'm going to just give you quickly 5 lessons from Traweza's work and from analysis we've done of work with open data around the world. First, sounds obvious, but it's often forgotten. Start with the problem you want to solve, not with the data. All too often people come across an interesting data set and say, oh, good, let's dive into this, let's find some interesting numbers that we can pull out, some interesting statistics, let's present them in fascinating ways. Change is bound to happen. It doesn't work like that. It can work like that, but I think it's far more powerful if you have a particular problem in mind, if you're working with a particular community that identifies their own problems, and then you find the data that's able to support that case rather than starting with the data. That's the starting point. Be rigorous with the evidence and open to change your mind. What I mean particularly on this is actually about what works. So if you come across a case, as we did, with a program that's had an awful lot of money invested in it, if it's not working, then think about why it's not working. All too often, I think in development as a whole, we're very unwilling to cut off the funding for something halfway through, where we're invested in something and it's not working. We're not very good at admitting that something is not working. We're not very good at changing tack. I think actually in open data work, it's actually much easier to change tack than it is in some other areas. But I still don't think we're very good at that. Most of the time, the real revolution will be about the small data in my life. What does that mean? That essentially means going back to that family that we started at the beginning. What's the data that's interesting to them? It's not data about whether Tanzania is getting more funding than Kenya. It's not even the data about whether Njombe district is getting more funding than Korogwe district. It's the data about the school that their children are going to. It's the data about the village that they live in. It's the data about the road that takes them to the market. It's data at that level that is interesting and useful to people. And really, if we're talking about data evolution, that for me is a fundamental thing that we need to be going for disaggregation to the lowest possible level as a fundamental part of what the data evolution needs to be about. Meaning comes from narrative, from comparisons. This is about how to, if you're presenting information, data in whatever form, this is about how people internalize that data and consider it as being relevant to them. I've got another image for you here, it's a cartoon. I don't think it's in Swahili, but I think it's probably fairly obvious what's being said there. That 160 million shillings could be spent on one brand new Land Cruiser, or it could be spent on an awful lot of classrooms and desks. So there's a comparison, there's something that people can latch onto and say, if there's this much money, why are we spending it on that rather than this? It's making it real, making it relevant, and so on. I could equally have talked about, in terms of comparisons, I could be talking about the performance of one school compared to another school. So it doesn't just have to be such extreme comparisons on how the money is spent. It can be very localized comparisons as well. Be clear about how you will get from here to there. the theory of change. We all talk about theories of change these days, but I think it's a particularly important idea for open data work, not least because we seem to have this assumption that data, information leads to knowledge, leads to change. There seems to be an awfully big jump in the middle there that all too often we don't really consider what fits in the middle, what turns data and information into people taking action, people changing policies, people delivering better services. I use this chart an awful lot in various places. You've got data over here, you've got something positive happening over there. We really need to look at what all that what in the middle is. And there's an awful lot of different ideas that people are coming up with from what might go in the middle, but I don't think anybody, frankly, has really answered that question as yet. I can give you one first attempt at an answer to that question, which came from some evaluators from Troyes' work. And they came up with a list of all these questions. If you're presenting somebody with information, are they going to take action as a result? And you've got to answer all these questions. The answer has to be yes to every single one of them. If anything is going to happen, do I understand it? Is it new? Is it worse than expected? Etc. 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 Actually, when they put this together, they were simply talking about whether presenting information to community members would encourage them to take action. They didn't even get to the point of whether the government would do anything as a response to that action being taken. So this is for me, this is one of those whats in this diagram. There's an awful lot more whats that we need to go in there to complete that picture, to make it really happen. Conclusion, revolutions are driven by people, not data. I'm repeating the point because it is, I think, so important. And two final points for data to aid the revolution, three things that really matter: people, politics, and relationships. In the end, that program that I talked about in Tanzania, Maji Matone, the reason it failed was that we didn't engage properly with people and with local politics. We were asking people to send information about broken water points. They didn't feel that the politics were conducive for them to do that. People were telling us that if they send in information about the broken water point, they'll be labelled as a troublemaker. So they were not willing to do so. They didn't feel the chances of anything happening as a result of sending that information were sufficient to justify the risk that they were taking and that we were asking them to take. So we didn't get that, we didn't make our offer right to people, we didn't get the politics right, we didn't have the right relationships with them to make it work. And to make it work, we need these three things: curiosity, openness, and a willingness to be different. And I'm sure on time I won't go into all those in detail, but I think the points are relatively clear. Thank you very much.
So as I find the next PowerPoint, I'm getting good at this, I will hand over to Erinch Sahan.
Hi everyone, I trust you can all hear me. My name's Erinch Sahan. I work on private sector business and poverty issues at Oxfam, ranging from our enterprise development work in cooperation with big business to improve supply chains and make them more inclusive to people living in poverty, as well as campaigning on certain issues and trying to change the way business does business. And this is going to be an example that really is a story and a case that comes from our campaigning side, from our slightly more confrontational side of our work with the private sector. So I'm picking something from that end of the spectrum, but hopefully it illustrates a point and illustrates actually an example where the 5 lessons that Ben just presented can really be applied to this. And it'd be good to get a sense from people to see where we could have done some of this stuff better, given some of the great principles that have been outlined already in presentations. So I'm going to start with a story, you know, I want to take you to Indonesia, where the greatest number of palm oil, or the largest volumes of palm oil, are grown to feed into the world economy, to feed into global supply chains. And this is a fellow I met named Ahmed in Indonesia, who lives on the land that is now a major palm oil plantation. About 20 years ago, that land used to be used by local people like Ahmed to grow rubber, which was, within the context of the broader forest. There was a deal struck between a company, which is from the same region, and the government, and nobody had land tenure there. There was no piece of paper stipulating who owned the land, so communities were thrown off their land. And the river that they used to use to transport their rubber plantation or product and crop from rubber, as well as using for fishing, using for their own water consumption, has now been diverted. So that's him looking down onto the river and really symbolizing the change that's happened in this person's life and the community that he represents over 20 years. Deforestation is now rife. There's been huge amounts of slash and burn in the area. Peatland forest is being burned, which is a huge issue in itself for global climate change ambitions. And we've got a situation where people are working as workers, day workers, where they rock up every day to the palm oil plantation hoping they get a job, have absolutely no secure tenure of employment, and are paid more or less a pittance. So that's the situation that person is in. And we wanted to try to help that. And that's an example that really comes from many parts of the world, whether it's palm oil, whether it's soy, sugar, cocoa. It comes from various angles and various geographies across Africa, Asia, Latin America, where people have very little voice, people have very little power and say over what happens to them, their land, their livelihoods, connecting to global supply chains, connecting to global big business. So we asked ourselves the question, how can we leverage change? Where's our entry point here to change the lives of people like Ahmed so that they're not completely thrown off their land and the terrible things that happen don't happen anymore? And we traced it back to some of the world's biggest food companies. In no way are we saying they're doing the bad things, but they link in. They're in a lot of cases buying the palm oil, buying the sugar, buying the soy that has the impact on these people's lives. So we started digging, thinking, well, what can we see? What are these companies doing about the issues that we're coming up with on land rights, on water, on climate change, on smallholder livelihoods, on worker rights, and all these issues that we're seeing on the ground? These big global companies that are, in some cases, representing over half of the world's purchasing of those, and have huge amounts of leverage to change the way people do business down in the supply chain. What are they doing, and how do they rank against each other? So we pulled up all the information out there, and there is a lot of information out there. There's really sometimes too much information. Some of it is PR, some of it is purely to mitigate against the risk of people accusing them not of doing anything. And others are genuinely leaders in this field and are trying to do their best to change the way business is done in their supply chains. But what really came flying off the page was, there really wasn't any systematic way to understand who was doing more or less. There were snippets of information, there's projects out there, but on some of the major commodities, we really weren't seeing any way a consumer, a community member like Ahmed would be able to see, what is the final company doing in this? This company that has got the trust of consumers and the public around the world, what are they doing to change my life? That information really wasn't presented in a useful way. So we went away and we pulled out some of the experts we could find in this field. We spoke to people in industry, we spoke to multi-stakeholder initiatives such as Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, and then Sustainable Food Lab, a lot of these industry groups as well, to say, what is best practice on these things? Well, what kind of information should we be looking for, and what demonstrate a company cares? And we pulled out indicators, and we went away and assessed what companies are doing more or less, and we summarized it all in a scorecard. And this scorecard was really aimed at simplifying some of the complexity that's in the field. It takes the world's 10 largest food and beverage companies who have an immense amount of power. 3 of the chocolate companies that you're seeing there buy about 40% of the world's cocoa, for instance. You've got the world's biggest buyer of sugar, Coca-Cola, not only volumetrically important, but also symbolically important. You've got the world's biggest buyer of palm oil, Unilever. You've got companies that can really, if they were to use their power, could really change the way business is done in some of these supply chains. A lot of them are taking some steps, some of them aren't. And we really want to be able to see a snapshot of who's doing what how can consumers and the public engage with all this information where there is information overload. And we broke it down and simplified it even more. So we went back and we said, right, well, that scorecard is good for people that want to engage. But what about supporters who don't even understand necessarily what a land grab is, or what what water rights are in a supply chain? How do we summarize this? How do we get it to a point where they can really understand what's going on? We really simplified it down to these sorts of communications that you're seeing here. And it turned into some more controversial things that got a lot of attention. We've had over 400,000 people sign petitions, millions of people exposed through Twitter and Facebook, and there's a whole different story of how that was accomplished and how we use that data to get to that point. But we really tried very hard to get supporters in the public to start engaging with the issues we were seeing and start looking at how they can tell the companies that this isn't good enough, you really need to step up on this issue. We picked gender to start off with, not only because as development professionals we're aware that you empower women, you get development running, but also it was an area where it was a major blind spot for the companies. There were a couple of pilot projects here and there, but how are they systematically empowering women in terms of economic decision making? In cocoa, a lot of the pre and post harvest is done by women, but they don't get any of the training. What can they do to make sure their suppliers are giving training to women so that they've got more valued skills and they've got better ability to have empowerment in their own communities? So we focused on that, and we went away and we asked the 3 big chocolate companies publicly, through our supporters as well as ourselves, through private conversations as well, and speaking to the investor universe as well, who were very concerned with this and really liked the fact that we'd summarise this data in quite a sort of simpler and quantified fashion. To go and do some simple things. I won't go through details, but all 3 of the big chocolate companies took action, and they're still following through on some of those demands that supporters and communities put on them through their campaign. And we started seeing a bit of a race to the top going on. So when this information became systematic, when it was presented to the public and the public were engaging with it, we saw others start moving. Unilever started saying, well, we don't want to be left behind. We realise we don't have a strong policy on gender rights. Let's put something out there, let's make some commitments, let's understand where our impacts are on women on some of the other commodities that we've got some leverage on. Nestle moved, Coca-Cola moved, General Mills moved. So we started seeing a huge amount of movement. Then we went to the other blind spot that we saw, which was land, and land rights, land grabs, and a lot of the companies were saying, we don't break the law. What do you want about Oxfam? We ask all our suppliers, as long as you don't break the law, that's fine by us. But that wasn't good enough. In a continent like Africa, 90% of the land is not registered. Breaking the law it only applies to 10% of the land. 90% of it, you can throw communities off their land through doing a deal with the local government, and that's fine. No compensation required, no consultation with local communities required. And this was a huge risk for not only for their investors, but also for communities. So we felt like they had this blind spot they needed to address. And we went out and started communicating about it, saying, look, let's start with sugar. It's a common commodity across some of these companies. You've got some real symbolic heavyweights and volumetrically huge heavyweights like the Cokes and Pepsis. And we asked them to take a stance to demonstrate they were going to have zero tolerance on land grabs. We did a whole bunch of real world and live campaigning to accompany this as well. And we were incredibly pleased to see Coke take a leadership role. Coca-Cola became the first global company to commit to the principle of free, prior and informed consent, something that's actually in human rights law but only applying to indigenous communities. But they said, actually, we're going to say this applies to all communities, regardless of technically whether they're considered indigenous or not under human rights regulation. If you're going to come in and buy and get some land and grow a commodity that we're going to buy off you, you better have consulted that community. You better have had some mechanism to get some sort of agreement from them, and you better have some plan to benefit that community. We don't want you just to be extractive on this land, which is becoming increasingly valuable. So we told the world, fantastic, Coke is really moving on this. We started speaking to investors, we started speaking to other companies, we started speaking to the World Bank to try to change its engagement with the private sector, UK government, various governments around the world, and Pepsi followed shortly after. And they started doing quite a sweep, they had quite a strong policy as well. And then the dominoes started to fall. 6 months before this campaign, everyone told us we were dreaming if we wanted companies at the top of a global supply chain to make a commitment on free, prior and informed consent for local communities. It wasn't their responsibility, they had very little control over this stuff. But when public started speaking out about it and information started to become available not only to consumers but also communities around who their local company was selling to. That actually that sugar estate down the road, they sell to Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola is making this commitment now, and suddenly you've got some leverage. If you raise your voice, you can get media attention because you're talking about something that's happening in Coca-Cola's supply chain. You can go and knock on the door of the company and say, hey, we've got this right that you're not actually enforcing. So now we've got 6 of the 10 big companies with more or less similar policies to Coca-Cola, and we're seeing a huge amount of change in that happening. So overall, after a year, we launched this in February last year, and we've been campaigning on various issues. We're seeing movement across the board, and we're seeing it on the issues we're focusing on and on the issues we've quantified and thrown information at. And a race to the top has begun. I mean, on a lot of these issues, it's really about collaboration between companies to be able to solve them. But at the same token, it's something that we really need to see leaders step forward and not just say, no one's doing it, it's too hard for us to move as a single unit. But the most powerful players to use their power to actually set a precedent to start moving the industry forward. So that's a scorecard. That's something that we're updating every 6 months. We're engaging with the investor world increasingly, actually, who are very interested in this, as a proxy for good management of a good company who cares about this stuff. And we're also trying to really ramp up our engagement in developing countries to see how communities can use this kind of information to hold local companies to account who might be linking up to global giants. So that's my case, and hopefully that fits in with some of the principles that we've seen. Thanks.
So that concludes our formal presentations from panellists, and thank you so much for the preparation that's gone into this. In a minute we're going to open it up to the floor for reactions, thoughts, other input from all of you. We've asked Ava on our left to, Neva on our left, I'm never pronouncing your name right, on our left to do the first reaction to all of that. So in 5 minutes I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Nick. And just want to check that the microphone is on, okay? I think so. Anyway, so my name's Neva Freshville, and I work for CAFOD, where I'm the lead policy analyst on Post 2015. And at first I thought, brilliant, I've got the really easy job where I just have to respond. I don't have to do a presentation myself. I actually don't think that that's now the case. I'm going to try and outline 5 points that occurred to me during listening to the presentations from everyone else. I'm really interested to hear where the audience takes this as well. I'm going to try and be relatively blunt and challenging, because I think that makes for a more interesting discussion than just platitudes, although thank you very much for Restless Development for inviting me to be here today. So the first point that I want to make is that I feel that there is a huge opportunity in the shift from the Millennium Development Goals to the post-2015 development agenda in how accountability works. However, are the governments that are currently negotiating this and their missions in New York aware of that opportunity, and are they willing to take that step on board? I think that it's something that is not, I've just come back from a week in New York myself, and there's very little discussion or openness or flexibility on the part of the majority of governments to these ideas. And I think to a large extent, it's because participation of people in a meaningful way threatens their power. And that's one of the kind of key issues that we have to look at in this debate. My second point is that the high-level panel was great in terms of civil society and global civil society participation. I think it would have been wonderful if we'd had a little bit more time to prepare civil society participation in order to ensure that it really was inclusive. But I really respect and commend the amount of effort and attention they put to ensuring that there was interaction between various constituencies, youth included, and the panel members. And some panel members really went above and beyond in ensuring that they spoke to and understood the voices of people on the ground. However, they are not the decision-making body, and the process has moved ahead, and we're now looking at the Open Working Group, who are currently negotiating in New York. It's highly political, it will get only increasingly political, and on Friday they discussed governance, and there are 2 issues which, among many others, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, but the 2 issues that are very vulnerable at the moment are governance and climate change. And unless there is a very strong civil society push or a very strong pull from a lot of sectors, I mean governments and the private sector included, I think it's unlikely that we'll have the space in the framework itself that will enable us to have traction in terms of implementation, monitoring and accountability. My third point is around how participation needs to be meaningful. As I mentioned, I've been involved in the post-2015 process for a couple of years now, and I've been in a lot of different kind of consultations, deliberations, debates, and while some have felt as if they are very meaningful, some have felt as if they are little more than a tick box exercise. And I've yet to be involved in a consultative process where you actually have impact over the decision making. I mean, partly it's because I'm civil society rather than a decision making myself, but I think we need to be pushing for not only consultation in these processes, but participation in these processes, and there is a big difference between the two. And just to add on to that, tokenism in participation is a real challenge. I think it's a challenge for all constituencies, but definitely for young people, because so photogenic, so great for that opportunity to take a great photograph. My fourth point, and I promise you I won't be much longer, is around inclusion in technology. I think that we run the risk of focusing on technology to the extent that we exclude the people who need this revolution the most, who are the poorest, the most marginalised and the most excluded. And I was really glad to hear Ben talk about some of the events that he's been to, where people are looking at the data revolution entirely through a technoclasical lens, because very rarely do people actually talk about what this means for people on the ground. It made me think of the revolution will not be televised. Well, it's kind of like the revolution will not be tweeted. It has to be more than that. And then finally, my fifth point is, how is this relevant to northern governments? Because we're talking about a post-2015 development agenda that is universal. And if this isn't also something that has relevance beyond how DFID implements its aid around the world, but also to what it means for young people in this country, then I think that we won't have been living up to the full potential of post-2015. Thanks.
Neva, thank you very much. Brilliant. I think that's all. Good. So thank you so much for those initial reactions, and exactly the bridge from some inspirational ideas from panelists and thinking to questions from all of you. I'm going to open it to the floor. I don't know, Dawn, whether we've had a couple of tweets.
I've had a couple of things come through.
Well, let me hold on that for a second and see. There's normally a silence in the beginning, and then it gets going and people can't stop. So, but two hands are already up. So your hand is up first. Please do introduce yourself, and then Rob after.
My name is Laura Hutz, I work for BBC Media Action. And I was just wondering, building on Ben's presentation, whether you have a kind of complementary theory of change to deal with some of the other barriers which stop people from participating or using information. I was kind of, when Nick was presenting, I was interested in the kind of know your policy work you're doing up in Zambia.
Yeah.
And I could think of lots of reasons, apart from knowing your policy, why girls with babies wouldn't be going to school. I mean, practical reasons, not just politics, practical reasons, social and cultural reasons. So I was wondering if you've done any thinking about how to, there are lots of big challenges out there, but about how to address some of those other barriers to the use of information within the context of the big idea.
Let me give a couple of answers from my point of view, and Ben, then perhaps jump in. So just on the Know Your Policy, it's a really nice example for this discussion, because that's just one cartoon set. The actual work that we're doing is multi-level. So it's working with girls about choices, about the environment that they're in, getting into every school and making sure that the school understands that the reason a girl is not coming back to school is it's just not conducive for them to do so. There's sort of condemnation when girls are coming back in there, the fact that they have a baby that needs to be looked after, the fact, etc., etc. So it has to be multifaceted. What is the access to clinics and being able to get medicine? So the campaign and the processes are rootsy and right there at the heart of stuff. You know, Restless starts as a programmatic organisation, so 80% of it is not about know your policy. But a piece that we found that was missing is that the policy exists and yet head teachers don't know it exists. and the policy exists, and yet local Ministry of Education offices don't really believe it exists and can't remember whether that's right or not. So it was just a crucial element in the piece which is relevant to the big idea. But absolutely, it's a social dynamic, not just a sort of policy one that we're engaging with. Ben?
Yeah, I think it was a question for Restless Development rather than for me, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
but
it's more about your theory of change for the...
Yeah, I just want to add one brief point there, which is that I think, for me, work with data is always, or usually best, when it's firmly rooted in other work that's also going on that's not necessarily data work. That data is part of a toolkit of approaches that can be applied to a problem, rather than here's some data, let's see what we can do with it, here's the problem, what can we bring to solving that problem, which may involve actually in some cases say actually in this case it's not about data. Though I think well, I got a sense as I was talking that I was coming down as a downer on the whole thing. I am a big fan of data. I think an awful lot can be done with data, but I think there are some serious challenges with it as well. I just wanted to add the point about data as one part of a bigger problem.
Just as a quick introduction, there's a couple of people who are leading the big idea from our end. Nicole, do you want to sort of wave wherever you are? So Nicole, who's leading the big idea from the start to finish and has written more theories of change drafted than I think she probably cares to imagine. And also over here on the left we have Mark and Stacey, who are the Director of Policy and Practice and Head of Policy and Practice, and Rachel, who's been organising you all to come here. So please, as these questions come out, do jump in. So maybe, Nicole, I'm going to put you on the spot on, in terms of as we develop a theory of change, do you feel in developing it there's any answers to the questions that are being posed around the sort of the weak spots in data?
I could just like basically echo what Brendan said. I'm glad that someone else is kind of summarizing it very nicely in a way to say it's not about basically what Ben said, like not just coming from the data and it, but embedding it in other tools and mechanisms that already work. So it's not a completely new thing, but it should be kind of linked to other approaches about capacity building, awareness raising, advocacy, and so on. And I guess like just bouncing it back to the panel a little bit, like when I had a conversation with Emmanuel just like a few weeks back, like that was exactly what he expressed towards me in terms of his excitement about the big idea, to say that it's not just addressing just advocacy or just capacity building, but what we're trying to do is like approaching it from different angles and basically trying to find the right mix that, as Ben said, it is addressing the what, the big section in between on how to get beta plus what is making us achieve that change or getting that change.
Brilliant. Rob, your question, and then Joe.
Thank you. I'm Rob Williams. I'm from Warchild, and we are working with Restless on taking the big idea and making it work in conflict areas, which is where we do our work. And the panel event's been great for me to get me thinking about how it's going to be slightly different in a conflict area. So a lot of the discussions about how young people can hold governments and local authorities to account. In some parts of the world, making choices about how much goes into food aid and how much goes into water. And in general, you can characterize the humanitarian system as being extremely adult focused. So in a refugee camp, the bizarreness is that although the first survivors are normally children and their mothers, one of the last things to be put into a refugee camp is a school or a child-friendly space. Because decisions are being made by adults. And I'm really interested in using the big idea to fill the gap between the young people who get these humanitarian services and the folks who make decisions. And I'm thinking that they might be able to influence the local UNHCR camp management. But what that person is going to be listened to also are the donors who are providing the funds for that camp. And somehow the big idea for me has to get right from children in Zaatari camp in Syria where only 18% of them get to go to school, back through the agencies delivering those services right up to the donors who are providing that money in the first place. So I think it's really interesting. I don't feel obliged to come up with a question because I haven't got one. I was just kind of taking the big idea and putting it into a conflict setting.
That's a question, we'll take it as rhetorical.
Yeah.
Shall we, Joe, sorry, you had a question.
It's just, it's expanding. The big idea is amazing, as we've been discussing. It's very, very big. It's broad reaching. There's lots of different areas. It's aiming to influence a lot of people at different levels. Can you talk me through, or talk us through, in one of the pilot countries, bearing in mind, I think the really valid points that Ben particularly made earlier about how you relate issues to people, and how to make issues very relevant to people so they're going to want to engage in this. And also bringing in your earlier points about how a lot of this was based on qualitative research, so not data, not quantitative research that you've been carrying out earlier. How are you going to mix all of these things? Can you talk us through what this might look like in one of your pilot countries, and in terms of who you would be trying to influence and how that engagement would happen?
Brilliant. I forgot to introduce you, and you didn't introduce yourself. So Joe Cook from DFID, who has been behind the investment and support for the initial part of the big idea. Thank you for that. So I'm going to, because I have the privilege of doing this, delegate that question to one of my colleagues. But just before I do, I'm going to, and perhaps Emmanuel, in fact, can give a sort of run through of how it's going to look in Ghana as a pilot. But just as a principle to that answer, one of the important things for Restless is this starts with the stuff that we're already doing and is nothing to do with the MDGs originally. That's the story I was telling. This starts with the idea that young people already care about things that we have identified with those young people that are very local. Our pitches are local, if sometimes urban and sometimes rural. They're local problems that they're dealing with, like girls who can't go to school because they're pregnant and they don't realise they can, or they don't have the way to go there. And so the big idea is asking exactly that question. Is it possible to translate what we definitely know can work, which is getting young people at the heart of debates until things change? The Karamoja example is a beautiful example of young people who did their qualitative research and have now taken that to go and find out what the real data is. And they've written a new piece called Ekoye Netem, which is in the local Karamojong language is knowledge and power, or knowledge and processes of power. And what they've decided and concluded, a little bit like conflict, is the answer isn't national or local government. The answer is amongst the chiefs and elders and how decisions are made in the local area. And so they've decided that our issues are not being answered, and we've got to work out how these power constructs work in local meetings. And so they've gone and made presentations to the local chiefs and elders saying, we believe you're making decisions here, and that's why our girls aren't ending up going to school, and we would like to have a process that means that we can influence that. So then the question is, how on earth does that relate to the MDGs? And that was where the big idea is born, and ultimately 59 organisations working in every country in the world is crazy stuff. And it's how do we get a logic, as Ben set out, between what matters to those people in Karamoja and slowly realising that they can also be impacting on broader development processes that Uganda are desperate to succeed in. Because DFID, the UN, and everyone else are working and focusing on Karamoja, but they're not finding out about these power processes. So can we help those young people make a link between this amazing stuff they're doing with local chiefs to the big processes that are going on, and see and get excited by why that matters? So I'll stop there because it's a generic answer. Do you want to give, in sort of 2 minutes, a sort of specific local example of what you're going to do in Ghana?
Yeah, just briefly, because I think your question is more about how do we actually get about doing this more practically and making sure that on one hand it's youth-driven, relevant to young people, and on the other hand that the data itself is valid, if that's your question. So on the first point, I think that we've so far we've tried to explain how young people themselves are already identifying their issues through their small groupings in the communities, and all of these communities coming together to form national coalitions. In Ghana, for instance, we have the Voices of Youth Coalition. I rushed the presentation a little bit, so I couldn't actually highlight the work that the Voices of Youth Coalition does. But it has membership from almost all of the districts, and now we have over 170 districts in 10 regions. And in each of their communities, they are able to identify the areas, the main challenges that young people face. And through that, they are able, and they're not getting solutions from, for example, the local government structures, whether health, education, and so on. So they are able to come together. What the big idea brings to the table is that they are able to come together, and through training and capacity building, the issues that they themselves have already identified will then be tested through this data process. And the question about whether the data has to be quantitative or not, the problem is that young people engaged in this process are not, unfortunately, research gurus. They are ordinary young people. Of course, some of them are educated, but most of them will not be educated. But open data is about making information, not reducing the information, but just turning it into a form or a format that is readily usable by everyone without necessarily watering it down or making the actual essence of it reduced. So we are able to then get young people to get that information, get the findings from the community level. Let me use specific examples. So the Youth Manifesto outlines, for example, the challenges that young people face in health. So if in a community, young people determine that there aren't sufficient youth-friendly services in, say, District A, and therefore set about to understand what the challenges are, what kinds of resources is that local government receiving on an annual basis from central government, and where the resources are going. And is it that the resources coming from the central government are insufficient, or that they come and they go to the wrong places, or that they don't even come at all? All of that, young people will be able to assess them through a process that scoops out this information from the relevant quarters. Just as an example, the findings will then inform where the advocacy should be targeted. If the money is not coming from central government, then the advocacy is going to be targeted, of course, both at the local, but more importantly at the center. But if the resources are coming, but they are not being prioritized in the way that young people's issues are targeted, then of course they are going to target the advocacy more towards the local government leaders and officials. So basically this is how, I'm not sure if I've answered you, but this is an example, just one example of how we can get about doing these things already. The mobilization is there, the young people are doing these already, but Big Idea is able to stimulate that to the next level, that ability to actually scrutinize what the information is already there, in order that based on what we know, we can influence decisions at local and central level in a more constructive way.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more from the floor. Paul, you had your hand up, and then I'm going to take a couple of tweet questions.
I'm Paul Zuckerman, and I am an old friend of the person who founded Restless Development, who founded it because he believed in young people. So I'm delighted to still be around to see you working with young people. The thing that concerns me, though, is I heard the word research twice. I've heard the word quantitative data. I heard you say just a second ago, real data. And when I look at the climate change debate and the mess that that's gone into, because people were accused of playing with data, you've got to be terribly careful pinning so much on data collection, that you are being rigorous and that you're using it in the right way. And I just raised that question about collecting data, basic data, field data, in situations that you've been describing is deeply complicated, has been always, and still is. There are endless issues that haven't been dealt with in terms of how you measure agricultural production and things like that. And all those interrelationships within a family, like you had, or within a village, are deeply complicated. And Oxfam may be pointing the finger at sugar producers and the question of land title. But land title has been an issue for 50 years. And, you know, we've all battered away at it. And governments know it. And Ethiopia in particular uses it in a particular way to produce famines. But, you know, I question sometimes, I don't want you to put your foot into what is a hornet's nest. And in the end, after all this work, you're using it to go after a chieftain and say you're not listening to us. That makes a lot of sense. But you've got to be really careful where you tread with this data collection, because you could end up just being taken to the cleaners. I'll give you one example, because you happen to mention Tanzania and water. I remember being present when AmRef was dedicating a new borehole. And, you know, one has a long ceremony to go on. I wandered around and asked people, how's it going to change health? You know, those things. And I talked to a young lady, actually was a teacher, and she said, well, it's only going to have one effect. And I said, what's that? She said, it's going to stop the rain. I said, what? It's going to stop the rain. I said, what do you mean? So that the girls don't have to walk through the forest now for an hour when they get rain. You have to be very careful to encapsulate that. Your point about you've got to understand what people are worrying about, thinking about is so important. So all I say is collecting data is frightfully important. Just be careful, there are lots of kind of man traps in there.
Thank you very much for an important point. So I'm going to ask Dawn if you can read a couple of the questions.
Yeah, so we've had two come through. One question to the panel is, what do you think are the incentives you can use to steer young people to actively take part in the data-driven initiative?
Brilliant. Why would young people want to be interested in this stuff in the first place? Do any of the panelists want to have a go at that, or shall I choose a colleague?
I'm happy to have a quick stab, just from the agriculture space, where we're seeing swathes of youth leave agriculture in developing countries for the cities. It's a real issue not only for them but also for the rest of us who need food and who need more production as demand rises around the world. It's something that I think provides them an opportunity to really understand what the risks are and what the opportunities are, and what their rights are. So in the agriculture space, if they were able to understand, what their likely yields are going to be, what their likely prices are going to be, how stable markets are likely to remain, they're more likely to stay and more likely to invest their own time and energy into it. So just a small snippet from there in terms of lack of information can really create a pessimistic image that drives people away from agriculture.
Brilliant. Any of the business guys want to respond? Yeah.
I mean, just very quick one in terms of incentives. Like you said, information then results in change. So ultimately, at a very broad level, when young people's current situations are changing positively as a result of a data-driven process, then of course they are more likely to dedicate their time into engaging in such a process. But more specifically, in terms of capacity building and skills development, we are working, at least for the Ghana project design, as I showed a few minutes ago. We're ensuring that there's a big component for skills development, new skills for most of the cases, but for just a few, there might be a possibility that this is just a skills upgrade. This is at a very personal level, should be a lot of incentives for any young person to want to engage in the process. But like I said earlier on, for me the biggest one is that we are able to change from a previous state to a new one as a result of a data-driven advocacy. So to be more specific, in one of the communities during the consultations, they said that they had to trek for a couple of hours to be able to get to their schools. Because any time the government allocates money for classrooms, it went to another community. During one of our forums, the district director of education said, well, we've heard what you've said, and for this academic year, we're going to situate one of our allocations of school classroom blocks in your district. Now, if advocacy meant that young people no longer have to trek 3 hours to get to school, 4 hours, half a day to get to school, then of course when you call on them to come out and to go out there, collect more information and be part of the process, I think the incentives could not be even greater than that. So ultimately they look at what is in it for them, whether at a personal level or at a community level.
Thank you. I mean, just to add, my experience at Restless is young people love data. I think it's one of the greatest lies that we keep repeating, that young people aren't into numbers and data. They love it. They will eat it up. They will regurgitate it. They'll turn it into cartoons and into videos and into films. They love to be helped to hold people to account. What Paul was saying is right. We need to be careful with it, but the power in that Mo Ibrahim forum, it didn't necessarily matter how accurate it was just young people now had an equal platform to talk on. That is the powerful part of this. We need to be very careful when we talk about data. You were right to talk about the sophistication of democracies in the north, south, east or west. I mean, when you listen to Nick Clegg and the UKIP guy, what's his name, Farage, standing, talking to each other, they're just throwing data at each other, but it's their version of data. But while we mock it, that's where the power therefore lies. And young people, when they have no access to any knowledge in any part of these processes, definitely won't be able to hold the UN and governments to account. So for us, we find it's the flip side. Young people absolutely love doing the research, taking the numbers. Those national statistics are done by young people in surveys all over Tanzania, and they are very powerful when they are brought. And yes, people can doubt them, but in the end, they don't have anything else, so they use our document. Because young people produced it, and if a researcher looked at it, they'd probably weep at some of the way we've got the numbers. But it exists, it's there, it's usable, and it gives them power to be able to do it. One little tangible example is in Zambia. I don't know if anybody from ActionAid is here. Raise your hand if you are. Richard Miller gave me a call, the CEO of ActionAid at this end, and was just talking about other things, and talked about the Zam Sugar sort of exposure of their lack of corporation tax being paid in Zambia, which many of you will have read about. You guys at Oxfam no doubt know about it. It was a brilliant campaign. He was talking to me and I said, oh, we have a radio show. We could get young people involved in it in Lusaka. And to answer the question directly to the Twitter feed, the answer to how do they get engaged in data, the guys who ran the radio show thought, well, they're not going to know corporation tax and they're not really going to know about Zam Sugar. So we're going to change this. What we're going to do is we're going to do a phone-in and tell them the exact number that is the corporation tax that they should have spent in Kwacha. Call it 1 billion Kwacha, probably 100 billion Kwacha. And do a phone-in on what do you think could be done if the government were given 100 billion Kwacha and they could put it towards poverty and poverty alleviation in the country. The phones go wild, the radio show goes mad, they love it, and only halfway through they go, just for your information, the biggest sugar corporation in this country who is doing X, Y, and Z, that is the amount of money that they are not spending on corporation tax to be given to this government to spend on those kinds of things. The young people took it up and made a campaign out of it and had real fun with it, and it was a very successful campaign by ActionAid. So it's just an example to that. Let's take another question from the floor. Yeah, you had your hand up.
At the moment, chair, so you can see my name is Anna. I work as an advocacy manager at Publish Culture Fund. Very, very interesting to hear the different presentations, especially from the different levels of how people and organizations are engaging with information and data, from the local communities to NGOs also translating all the information that is out there in a way that can be picked up by different citizens or different groups in nationalities. So I commend also the organizers for this event, because that gives me a lot of ideas. We work for aid transparency, that's our mandate. We try to engage countries to publish their aid information so that can be used by either national governments or by people where this aid is supposed to go and benefit. So perhaps if the big idea can also ensure in a consistent way to get us participate in this conversation, because we are so focused sometimes in the supply side and we don't engage that much in the demand side, not because we don't think it's important and not because we think that just having the data out there just will solve every problem. It's because the resources needed for our advocacy towards countries and big donors is so much. Sometimes we just don't have the spaces to have these conversations. And yeah, it would be very, very good to keep exploring more of these spaces so we can bring to our own work these issues and also use it as examples so countries know exactly why they should be publishing their information and in the way we expect them to do, with quality, timely, the data published timely and in an adequate way that everybody can understand. So those are my comments.
Brilliant, really helpful, thank you. Anybody else from the floor? There was somebody at the front.
Yeah. So, my name's Tabby and I'm a development advocate for the support of Restless Development, as is Dawn, who's tweeting and live stream, so thanks. My question is around the private sector actually, and I'd like to know a little bit more just about what the incentives for the private sector are. I understand that behind the brand, that the threat of reputation and perhaps their competitors were the reason why they perhaps led to policy statements. But I just wonder, is that enough to actually involve the private sector? How can the private sector be involved in the big idea? And how can the data that comes out of the big idea not be almost exploited by the private sector? I understand behind the brand, in one of the statements it said that consent from the community in sort of property rights would allow it, as long as it was legal and it was consented to. But that consent can quite easily be like bribed or harassed and even use like the illiteracy of the community to take. So I just wanted to know, perhaps from your experience, how and why the private sector could be involved, and perhaps in the big idea too.
Sure. Thanks, Stan. All right. I mean, firstly, I mean, just to say that there's absolutely no silver bullet that we're looking for. I mean, commitment to free, prior, and informed consent doesn't fix the world's land grabs issues. But it's a step in that direction, and it changes the terms of debate at the very least, but also makes a bit of a difference. At least there's more consultation happening than there used to be, and forces companies to account for that and be public about that. So there's progress, but it's not the end game. In terms of incentives for the private sector, it's such a broad, brush thing. I mean, government's this big and private sector's that big. You go to the poorest parts of the world, you'll see markets happening there, but you won't see a school or a road. We talk a lot about governments, but businesses everywhere. There's tiny businesses, regional businesses, global businesses, and they've all got a myriad of incentives and reasons for acting the way they do. So for some of them, the big global players, the ones we're working with, who have a certain amount of power in the right places for us to achieve the change we want to achieve, it's very much about making a business case to them as well, that they need to see more secure and stable supply chains. They need to see better productivity in their supply chain. That's going to happen through flourishing communities and all the rest of that kind of case for why it's good for business to have development. They're going to benefit as well. But at the same time, there's others that are going to benefit from very cheap labour. There's going to be people that are going to benefit from ripping out the rainforest, and so that there's a myriad of incentives. And I think it's important to pick out the bits that work with you and use private sector allies sometimes, a surprising ally, to get the attention of the government to say, actually, it's not just us saying that, not just the youth of Ghana saying that, but look at this big company who's saying that, actually, we need transparency on corruption issues if we are to invest and be confident in your country's economy. And get them maybe to say things that we're not able to say, and we step away. We do a lot of that in the background, and people don't know we do that, but we've worked with lots of global companies to use their voice where there is a shared incentive there to improve governance and improve transparency, for instance. So I think it's important to really map out which part of the private sector has what kind of incentives, and you're right, it's
Restless and development, it's the contrast of the two. It's on the one hand revolutionary and radical, and says people need to get on the streets and say that's enough to the corporation tax, and get on radios and say what are you doing, and we've got the data. Governments do find that scary, and yes, at the UN level they're not going to be signing up to it. We may as well know that now. But in the words of Graça Machel when she was on the high-level panel, stop worrying about what we're all going to sign up and just get on and do what you do. You're civil society, and you all start sounding far too like governments. And it's true. If you'd heard the NGOs, if any of you were sitting in the NGO discussion, we just sound like a bunch of governments all vying for our own position. You know, the health guys say health, and the disability guys say disability, and the war guys say war, and it's... So Restless definitely also takes the other side, which is we want to get that data and we want to engage them. So to the question, will governments engage with this or get scared, which has been mentioned twice, our experience, and I'm going to sound horribly naive, is in Nepal, we've managed to persuade government to not only sign up to a youth charter that was written by young people, but we now have 3 young people embedded in 2 of their ministries full time. But the premise is that we will help bring knowledge so that you can better do what you are committed to doing. There is always a starting point that this is bad governments being told what is wrong to do. We're in that habit of NGOs here, governments there, and at the UN level with the Foreign Office, people sitting there and so on. Of course they're going to say no. But it is just not true that the ministries in Nepal don't want help from young people to unwind the knowledge that is there and put out amazing plans and sit around with huge pieces of paper and say, we think we've got 5 answers to why you're not achieving what you said you would in the West. And let's build a school nearer the people who are having to walk there, because you've got the budget. And so often it isn't corruption and those things. And I know that might sound naive, but I think it's because we come from a programmatic point of view. We've spent 25 years just working with governments to say, what can young people do to help it, and how can we get engaged? We've got young people embedded in every teacher training college in Zambia. They said, you're crazy at the beginning. Why would we want 21-year-olds with our trainee teachers, with all the professors doing the work? And we persuaded them they could bring something exciting and new. And all they do is provide knowledge and data about understanding what the trainee teachers aren't learning. And then we say, we can help. We can do all the non-formal education and sexual health learning and HIV prevention, and we'll write you a book at the end of it. And we have. And written a new comprehensive sexuality education thing that I was at 2 weeks ago that was being launched by our partners, UNESCO, CEDA, ourselves, and the government. And it's been amazing, and it was all designed, half of it was designed by young people. So it's a bit of a naive anecdotal answer, but that's how we approach it. Ben, give me something more serious, objective, and technical.
Hopefully not. What I was going to add was that I think, in my experience, the work with open data, work with transparency movements, etc. It's in some ways there's always going to be a degree of political confrontation going on, that you're asking for something that somebody somewhere doesn't want you to have. At the same time, there are always going to be allies within the government who would also like you to have that. So it would be wrong to either say government is always anti-transparency, just as it would also be wrong to say government is always pro-transparency. In practice, governments are made up of hundreds of thousands of individuals, and it's a question, in my experience, of playing a political game, essentially. You find out who your allies are, you work with them, you find out how the obstacles are, and you find ways of working around them. And yeah, essentially that's my experience that I think is relevant on that question.
Jump in, please, Mabel.
I know that I'm not a panelist, so I'm not
You
sure
are.
able to jump in here, but I just wanted to say I really agree with what Ben was saying, and I don't think I want to say that there's outright disagreement that governance is an integral part of the post-2015 agenda, particularly in the New York conversations. And I think that there is precedent of countries recognising the importance of governance. If you look at, I think it's Mongolia, who added a 9th MDG specifically on governance and human rights, to say, yes, this is a great agenda, but it lacks some key components that we need to see in there. So I think, I actually think it is a very winnable battle. I just think that we need to be aware that it's happening right now and we need to be engaged in it. And perhaps battle is even the wrong word. Maybe I should be using something that was like less confrontational and saying like this is a winnable debate or discussion or dialogue.
Brilliant. Right, we're hurtling towards 5:15 when you should all have a drink in your hands, so I'm sounding obsessed. Let's take one more shall we take one from online? Do you want to pick your favourite?
Okay, sure. So another one we've got here is, how do you ensure the right people control and own the data in the data revolution? How do we ensure citizen ownership?
It's all about Nigel Farage, who seemed to own the data in that debate. Does any data experts want to sort of talk through that? There's so many of you who are experts in the room. I mean, from the panel or anyone else. This is about how do we make sure that all people perhaps have control of the same data rather than the select few having control of the data so that they can use it for their own devices. Anybody else from the floor feel they have an expertise in that? Don't be shy. Otherwise I'm going to pick on the panellists.
Again,
Go for it.
to kick off, hopefully. So I don't have the response on how you can do this perfectly 100% of the time. But there's been quite a lot of discussion about data gathering and monitoring, and I think that from the work that I've been doing with the Participate initiative, which has been using participatory methodologies to understand what people living in poverty and vulnerability prioritise in their own development, a lot of it has been one of the radical things that I found in the process, rather than what's come out, is giving people the ability to analyse and communicate their own data. So their own information. A lot has been using qualitative methodologies rather than quantitative methodologies. And I think that's something that's very applicable to kind of global youth context as well. So not just saying what data can be extracted from youth demographics, but saying how do young people interpret and understand and use that information, how do they want to communicate it. And it means that it has to be much more of an interactive dialogue, which is a very fun phrase to use, but rather than it just being a one-off exercise, and it means, I think, embedding it within existing and ongoing relationships rather than it just being one part of the process. So I think that in terms of the broader monitoring and evaluation of the SDGs and the post-2015 development agenda, I think we will have to start shifting how we see that process taking place.
Brilliant. Any other Ben and Emmanuel?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that asking about who owns the data, who has access to the data, I think it's always useful to remember that our starting point is that at the moment, generally citizens, people don't have access to the data. So even if opening up data may empower some big nasty corporations to go around land grabbing, there are risks of that nature. Nevertheless, some kind of movement towards putting more data in the hands of people, in the hands of citizens more broadly, is still a big step from where we are at the moment, where data is not in the hands of those people at all. So I think, though there are risks, it would still be a big step forward to do it.
60 seconds. I just want to link that to the previous question about secondary data and the fact that probably, like you said, that should be the start point. In the case of Ghana, and I like to speak on the Ghana picture, fortunately, we have a great enabling environment with the start of the Ghana Open Data Initiative. If you could just note and have a look maybe tomorrow in the office, data.gov.gh, there's already over 870 data sets from 6 departments, 6 government departments, and they're continuing to populate that. When we met with them during a visit by the Big Idea team to Ghana, they said that by the close of this year, they're hoping to be able to decentralize that and go down to the district level. So hopefully that's a good thing, that we can already begin to see from a government perspective, raw data that comes from their various departments. There would be some challenges, for example, presentation. Most of this data come in formats that may not necessarily be usable. So we're discussing about how, and they've confirmed that if we're able to discuss ways in which we want the data, they are willing to be able to adapt it to how we want it. But some of this is already online at data.gov.gh. And to the question about how everybody owns the data, I think that's simply another way to say it is how open is the data. because accessibility and availability, especially in formats and ways that everybody can use it, is what makes data open. And for young people, ensuring that they bring their creativity in putting the data in ways that they appreciate more, makes it more owned by them as well. And this is what we intend to do in the Ghanaian situation. Thank you.
Brilliant. So I'm going to take one more question, and I hope it only needs a 1 minute answer. Go on, Rachel, you were pointing at somebody who's had their hand up. Sorry, I've been ignoring the back half. Yeah, go for it. Do you yeah.
Okay, hi, I'm Stephen Porter from DFID. I'm a results and evaluation advisor. I wanted to know more about how you think you can engage government around data. A lot of it has turned towards advocacy, but you started to say a little bit more about more positive forms of engagement. Perhaps you could expand upon that part of the programme.
That's definitely not a 1 minute answer.
Maybe just highlight some of the ways that you're doing there.
Yeah, well, you heard little bits from Ghana. I mean, overall, I would just refer back to the sort of examples that I gave through the right introductory presentation, the kind of how are we engaging on manifesto for elections, how are we engaging on knowing your policy, stuff that the government of Zambia actually want to be known out there. How can we produce data sets as well as young people so that government can use it and young people can use it and civil society can use it. I'm sort of loath to start giving deep examples mainly because of time. I'm wondering whether we should take it offline, but at least to give you a generic answer, I would say 80% of the big idea will be about constructive working dialogue with all partners, including government. It'll be about programs coming off it, research coming off it, knowledge being put at the centre, and setting out 3-year plans with young people, government and civil society and aid agencies on how we can tackle a short target that is not working in that country. It won't be so much about they get on the radio and say, why is Zam Sugar not paying their necessary corporation tax? In the main would be my generic answer to that. I'm sadly going to have to call a halt to this, but I would love it if we can continue the debate in here, and far more importantly, just down that glass corridor where a drink will be waiting. I just want to say a couple of thank yous before you walk out the door. The first is, and appropriately to DFID colleagues as you finish there, just to say thank you to Department for International Development, particularly Civil Society Department, have taken a massive punt on this. This is a big idea, and we all talk about innovation, and innovation is only innovation when we don't know what the end looks like. You don't invent new things, you don't find new brilliant ideas, because you know the answer already. And it's very unusual for bilateral organisations to take such a punt. And so thank you for taking that punt. It's given us the opportunity to kickstart this. The second thank you is to the panellists. They've been extraordinary. They have all done this because they support the idea, and in Tuare's case are already supporting us in Tanzania and helping us on the data side, and obviously in Ghana. But for all of you, thank you so much for taking out the time today and supporting us. Almost all of you in the room have connections to us one way or another, so thank you. Thank you for showing an interest, thank you for coming along. There's some very senior people in here and very busy people in here, very technical people in here who I'm sure have important things to do elsewhere. So thank you for taking out such a huge chunk of a day to come to see us. A quick thanks to all of the staff who've come in. I mean, our Big Idea team are pretty much as new to this as all of you. Many of them have come in from other organisations and are working night and day to make this happen. 4 months ago we didn't know where we were working, how we would pilot it or what this would really do. I just came up with this crazy idea sitting in a forum in the Mo Ibrahim conference in Senegal. It's going to be a tough ride. We don't know where it's going, but I want to finish by saying we are going to do this. It may end up not being the big idea. It will change, it'll transform. But Restless Development places young people at the forefront of change and development. And we are therefore committed to country by country, partner by partner, network by network, and alliance by alliance, work out ways that we can raise the voice of young people and add knowledge to their power set so that they are able to join the debates, join the conversations, and more importantly, take action and make poverty history in the long run. And that's what this is really about. So thank you so much for coming along today, and go and enjoy a drink.